Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
We don't know this for a fact, but reading between the lines, IoT equipment manufacturers are going to be responsible when all is said and done for data breaches. The FTC, Department of Commerce, and the FCC, especially the FCC and Department of Commerce, these rulemaking proceedings that are going on, they're all getting back to the security by design.
What's the legal definition of a product? Does it cover IoT, and is IoT classified as a product or a service? Given our laws were never designed for the types of products being sold today, it's not surprising that there are different interpretations of our current laws and regulations when it comes to IoT. In this episode of the IoT Business Show, I speak with Ron Quirk and Alex Schneider about the legal limbo we're in and how the legal landscape is evolving to catch up with the times.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is for business leaders and managers employing the Internet of Things for their business or the business of their customers. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair, and I interview the industry's leading authorities to find out how they use IoT to improve business and create value. If you like this show, subscribe to it on iTunes and go to iotinc.com to check out my complimentary articles, videos, meetups, and webinars.
I have a new website, more for my non-IoT Inc. work. There's still a few bugs, but the URL is brucesinclair.net. Check it out if you'd like to find out more about my upcoming book, online courses, workshops, consulting, and public speaking. Yep, I'm creating a few online courses that coincide with the release of my book. They're based on my workshops, my consulting, and of course my book. More about these soon. With me today on the IoT Show is Ron Quirk and Alex Schneider. Ron is head of the IoT practice group at the law firm Marashlian and Donahue, where he assists clients with legal and regulatory issues in the Internet of Things. Alex is an associate attorney at the firm, specializing in regulatory law analysis and compliance. Ron, Alex, welcome to the show.
Hey, Bruce. Thank you.
So you guys are tag teaming me today, huh? This is going to be kind of tough. Me against two lawyers.
We'll make this an interesting show, one way or the other.
So I got a legal question right off the beginning, or maybe it's a definition question. But regulatory law, Alex, aren't regulations and law different, or are you guys conflating the two there? What is regulatory law?
Oh, regulatory law is how agencies interpret statutes from Congress. And it's all done through legal means. There's administrative procedures that regulatory agencies take to implement regulations, and so there's a lot of interpretation of laws that have to go on, and so it's all very much a legal field.
Okay, so even though regulations aren't law, what you're saying is there's a legal interpretation of those regulations as there is a legal interpretation of laws. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Yes, and this is Ron. The only thing I would add to that is that most agencies like the FCC and Department of Commerce, et cetera, are rulemaking entities just described by Alex, but the Federal Trade Commission is strictly an enforcement agency, and they don't engage in rulemaking. So that's one area where just like to add that little clarification.
So now, if you guys have a specific practice on the Internet of Things, what prompted that, and when did it start?
Well, I've been head of the IoT group here for about 2 years, Bruce, and I come from a background of the Federal Communications Commission and the Wireless Bureau, and I did a lot of equipment authorization work for various large and small clients. And IoT is a very equipment-centric service. And there's also a lot of wireless component, obviously. So based on my background and considering how the Internet of Things is becoming such a huge industry now, we decided here at Marashlian and Donahue to start our own IoT group, and now we are growing by leaps and bounds.
Now, what's a typical, I won't say caseload, so a client load then that you will be handling? Are you handling 1, 2, 3, 4 clients at a time, or just to give us and give our listeners here just a sense of the magnitude of this within your firm?
Oh, we can handle several projects at once. I mean, some of our clients are not IoT specific, but they have IoT components within their companies. So say there's an equipment manufacturer who gets in trouble with the FCC by not properly getting their devices authorized and marketing them, and then somebody catches them. We go down to the Enforcement Bureau and represent them before the FCC Enforcement Bureau. Meanwhile, another company is trying to get their small cells or their distributed antenna system sited in various municipalities, and we help them dealing with the local governments to get permits and to deal with all the local regulations so that they can get their small cells and their DAS equipment sited. And we also deal a lot with tax issues, which is not within my bailiwick, but we have a lot of tax issues that come up. One other thing too is we work on a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and this is very important for IoT as we work on experimental licenses so that equipment manufacturers can test devices that emit RF frequencies without getting caught by the FCC. And then also we do a lot of rule waivers because IoT is such a new burgeoning industry that a lot of times the clients want to do things that aren't specifically in compliance with the FCC rules. So we draft rule waiver requests and get them authorization to do what they need to do.
So now what percentage of your time is spent with clients, or maybe what percentage of clients are coming to you because they need to remedy a problem with the government, so they've done something without, and then been caught, as you said, versus they're being proactive and they're looking forward and they're making sure that they're doing the right things right from the start?
Well, it sort of varies. I mean, a lot of the clients that have been with us for a long time, we help them with compliance issues. So if somebody's been with us for a while, they don't usually get caught.
Right, sure.
It's because they're in compliance. But we get a lot of red light clients that come in. Oh my goodness, the FCC sent us a notice of inquiry. What are we supposed to do? The FTC just sent us a notice. What should we do? And then we go about defending them in front of the various agencies. So I'd say it's probably 60% compliance right off the bat, and probably 40% clients in trouble, and us helping to get out of trouble.
Interesting. Okay. And you mentioned something that I didn't expect. Tax. Now, is this completely separate from IoT, or is there some relationship between tax and IoT, the law and regulations?
Well, this is a really interesting question, and I wish that Michael Donahue, our tax guru, were here. But just basically, Bruce, here's the issue with taxes right now. IoT has not been really defined, so to speak, in a legal sense as either a product or a service, okay? So, depending on how things shake out, and I expect they will probably within the next 2 or 3 years once these rulemaking proceedings are completed. If IoT is considered to be a service, it's going to be subject to various types of taxes. And if it's considered to be a telecommunications service, it's going to be subject to even further taxes and regulations. So it's all going to depend on the ultimate tax liability for IoT companies is how IoT is ultimately defined as either a product or a service.
So I understand the product part of it. So if it's a consumer IoT product, that's a no-brainer. If it's a commercial, industrial, infrastructure, got it. Maybe I don't have it. I'm assuming that's going to be taxed. or not? Is that kind of the gray area you're talking about? So let's say that it's a telematics system. Now, is that considered is that where you're getting at? Is this a service or a product, and then is there different tax liabilities associated with each?
That's a perfectly great question, actually, Bruce. Yeah, I mean, sometimes certain components of services can be considered to be a product or a service. But IoT, I think in general, there is going to have to be some working definition that's ultimately going to be used by not only the feds, but also the state taxing authorities. We came up with this with Voice over Internet Protocol over the past few years, and I don't want to go off on this because that's sort of off topic, but that evolved over a period of years, and now it's considered to be sort of a telecommunications service, and that subjects it to all different kinds of taxes in the states, as well as the federal telecommunications tax.
Okay, yeah, and I can as easily see that a lot of IoT deployments are both products and services. So I guess it is going to have to evolve over time. Okay, well, guys, why don't you start by giving us a little bit of background on yourselves and how it pertains to the Internet of Things.
Okay. I'll keep this as brief as I can, Bruce, but I've been a telecom attorney for over 20 years, and as I mentioned, I work for large AmLaw 100 firms in the FCC. I've basically worked on IoT matters my entire career. As you know, IoT has only recently become a hot topic, but it has been around in various incarnations for at least 20, 30 years now. And some of the projects that I've worked on, as I already mentioned, RF equipment marketing rules. Any device that emits RF energy is subject to the FCC's authorization and marketing rules. Again, representing manufacturers before the Enforcement Bureau. Small cell and DAS siting we already talked about, but briefly, just a few other items. Spectrum allocation. There's going to be a lot of unlicensed spectrum that's going to be sent out by the FCC pretty soon, and it's going to be available for IoT. Right now, one of the big issues is that a lot of the IoT systems work on the crowded 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi spectrum, right? And there's a lot of worry about interference. So the FCC is having proceedings for 5 gigahertz and 3.5 gigahertz, and it's really behooves equipment manufacturers and service providers to understand this so that they can tweak their devices to work on these new frequencies, among other things. So, again, I think I went through it the laundry list a little earlier, but very important, and last but not least, is cybersecurity and privacy, which we've been called upon many times to work on, and that's an evolving field, as you know. So I will turn it over to Alex for his background.
Alex, just before, I just want to ask one follow-up question for Ron. You mentioned the spectrum allocation. You didn't mention LPWA. So is this in the mix as well? Because that's also using an unlicensed, there's a couple spectrum bands, but it's also unlicensed. Can you maybe talk to that for a few minutes?
Oh, it all blends together, Bruce. And any sort of device or network that works on unlicensed frequencies, they're going to be subject to interference one way or another if the bands get too crowded. They're secondary to the licensed entities, and so the spectrum is getting crowded all the way through the existing unlicensed spectrum world. And so for anything unlicensed, I think that the FCC understands this, and they're issuing a lot more spectrum now in different spectrum bands.
Okay. So it's not that they're addressing it to regulate it. You're saying that they're just giving more of it out there, so it becomes less crowded.
Yes. Yes, and just very briefly, the FCC long ago used to have a lot of rules about what types of devices can work on what types of spectrum, but spectrum flexibility has become the byword for the past decade or so, and especially unlicensed. Basically any device can work on it, use it. If they're freaked to the correct frequency.
So no one that's working in an unlicensed, that has a product working in an unlicensed band right now needs to worry, at least from a U.S., and I guess we need to point that out. We are talking from a U.S. perspective, but at this point, they don't have to worry about some sort of regulation that's going to be coming around the corner.
Oh, yeah. Well, we could get into that, but just briefly, that there are some spectrum bands that still are reserved, unlicensed, like for medical devices.
Sure.
That too. So, that was a general 30,000-foot view of it. But there are still some specific services that are peculiar to certain spectrum bands. So if somebody is going to be putting out a service, they really should know. They should do an initial spectrum analysis.
Yeah. Yeah. No, good point. That's true. I was thinking LPWA, but yeah, you're right. I mean, there's all types of different spectrums. Alex, sorry to cut you off earlier. Give us a bit of background on yourself and IoT.
Yeah, so I work with Ron on IoT matters. One specific thing that I'll help, and along with colleagues at my firm, is analyzing discrete characteristics of products or services to determine this area of the product is regulated or this might not be regulated. And I'm also very interested in privacy issues related to IoT and other telecommunications services. There's so much data being created, and there's a lot of legal implications of all that data. I've also worked on some of these issues for a number of years, including a previous job at the FTC.
So you worked at. So would you be considered originally part of the swamp then?
Well, let me say we're near the Beltway, so we're not within the Beltway. So we have at least that perspective.
But you worked for the government before, and now you're working for private sector. Oh no, that's right. I mean, so anyway, but go ahead, Ron. You have something to say. I know it.
Oh yes, what we used to call Alex a jackbooted thug, but now he's okay. Now he's back on the right side.
He's back on the right side of things. All right. Well, today, I mean, I think we could talk spectrum all day, but we're not. We're gonna focus on security and privacy. So I think it's important. A lot of times people get the two mixed up. And they conflate the two. And I want you guys just to first let's talk about how is data security different from data privacy, specifically when it comes to laws and regulations.
Yeah. So I think first off, what makes data privacy different is data privacy is required, I think, or I'm sorry. So data privacy relates to a lot of the connectivity in IoT. Mm-hmm. So IoT has been defined in many ways, as we talked about, but a good working definition is the ability of objects to connect to the internet, send and receive data, and all of that data, all of that transmission and connectivity, is important for privacy because then you have large amounts of information, being created. Some of that's very sensitive information, right? You have geolocation information, financial information, health data. The FTC just yesterday came out with a settlement with Vizio, the company. They're going to pay $2.2 million because their smart TVs were collecting a lot of information.
A little too smart for their britches, yeah.
Exactly, a little bit too smart. So that the IoT creates a lot of data, and data, obviously creates a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of insight into information. Another example is utilities in smart homes, right? You're creating a lot of information about when a person is at home and how much they're drawing from the grid, and in some cases. We've seen law enforcement authorities using that information against the person who lives there. So, so there's just a lot of information there. But I do think that data security is is oftentimes considered to be a prerequisite for privacy, and and that's because let's data security, you can't have, private information.
Right. No, and I think that's a good point. I mean, let's just clearly define it. Security's tech, right? And privacy is going to be a risk. So it was going to be one form of risk, and that's going to be associated with business. And I think, that's a good way for everyone to think about it, is because sometimes you read some popular article on the web and they're starting with security, then they get into privacy, and they're really mixing up the two. But do you guys agree with that definition at a high level, tech versus business?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. I mean, and Alex, I'm going to want to talk about the different issues that you brought about earlier in terms of the different use cases and when privacy can become a liability, right? And that's and a risk and the liability associated with it. But let's talk about just the legalities of it. Now, IoT is new. Now, Ron, I have to say that we have kind of an ongoing contest on this podcast, and that is the person who's been working in IoT the longest. Now, you're not too bad. You're 30 years. I've around, I think 10, because if you squint your eyes, right, you could find something that was IoT. But we had one guest, Johannes Ernst. He was working on IoT since he was 8 years old. So you didn't win the award, but you came pretty close. But the point that you were making earlier is that IoT, is, even though parts of it have been around for a long time, this coming together different of these services and products is relatively new. And so the legal system is more or less trying to keep up with this. I mean, or keep up with it, I should say, keep up with the changes in the technology. So what makes it different legally than, say, the tech that's come before it? What's so different about IoT? Maybe just take us through your thoughts on that.
Okay. Well, the big issue is connectivity, and that's what makes IoT legally different from previous technologies.
Okay.
And the reason, there's many reasons. I'll just run off a few. I mean, first of all, we obviously have cybersecurity issues, right? Computer systems back in the day were rather contained, and they now with IoT, I mean, these devices, which I think we should discuss, the vulnerability of a lot of these devices and the sheer number of them just make IoT very, very vulnerable to hacking if security measures are not put in place at the design phase, which is where a lot of these federal proceedings are heading. I mean, the manufacturers are going to be, and we don't know this for a fact, but reading between the lines, IoT equipment manufacturers are going to be responsible when all is said and done for data breaches. Okay, the FTC, Department of Commerce, and the FCC, especially the FCC and Department of Commerce, these rulemaking proceedings that are going on, they're all getting back to the security by design. We don't know this for a fact, but reading between the lines, IoT equipment manufacturers are going to be responsible when all is said and done for data breaches. Okay, the FTC, Department of Commerce, and the FCC, especially the FCC and Department of Commerce, these rulemaking proceedings that are going on, they're all getting back to the security by design, and it's going to be very, very important for cybersecurity measures, very, very definite cybersecurity measures, to be implemented at the design phase of the IoT devices. Because if a device gets hacked, the connectivity it's going to just play havoc with the entire system. I mean, look what happened with the malware last October, right? Denial of service, right? That was huge, and it's the malware can really, I mean, they're getting very sophisticated with implementing that, and we have to make sure that the cybersecurity procedures are implemented. So connectivity really is what separates IoT from previous technologies.
You know, it's kind of complicated though, because if we break it down a little bit, we sort of put it underneath the magnifying glass. We've got data in motion, which is a lot of what you're talking about here, and Alex was talking about it earlier with the connectivity, and you have data at rest. So if I'm a manufacturer of, let's say, first thing that pops into my mind, let's say a doorbell, because we just went to a party and they had one of these IoT doorbells. So this doorbell obviously has an operational technology network, so a little network that's working within itself. Then it goes to the home network, hits the Wi-Fi, and then hits the internet. So the data in motion, and then it's stored on some server, some place in the middle of the desert or wherever it is. So now the data that's in the home, that's going to be transmitted to the Wi-Fi device, that I can understand, and you say design, and even going a little bit further, it's not even only in the design phase, it's through every phase of the development of the product. That I can understand would be the responsibility of the doorbell manufacturer. However, now there's two other areas. We hit the internet, and then we go to the servers, and the data now is no longer in motion. It's data. It's staying in a server somewhere. Who are they responsible for? The transmission of that data, which you could argue would be the telecom provider. Are they responsible for the storage of that information, which you could argue would be either the cloud provider, or I guess the cloud provider? Doesn't it get a bit gray there?
It gets very gray, and that's what these proceedings that are going on in Commerce and the FCC right now are teeing up. Just those questions, Bruce. Right now, it is such a gray area, and the feds are going to have to suss this out in order to get true cybersecurity guidelines. Because, for example, say that you're manufacturing the doorbell, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, and there's this data, and it goes in there, and if they don't have, say, patching on there, right? You're probably familiar with patching, right? Mm-hmm. Software designed to update the program. Then, they could be held responsible for a breach. But if they have the applicable security measures within the doorbell and the data does go out and somehow, it gets put on a server and somebody catches it or whatnot, again, it's hard to say, who should be held responsible. But that's one thing. The FCC and DOC and the FTC, for that matter, too, they really, truly want to get these issues resolved. So right now, there's no answer. But that responsibility aspect is key, and there's a ton of comments going on right now in these proceedings that by various interested parties that are addressing just this issue. So all I can say is just stay tuned.
So it's a work in progress. So what's your advice then for a company that's making a doorbell, or a company that's providing an uplink, or a company that's storing the data at this point? What would be your advice right now?
Okay, two things. I would first of all, I would submit comments in the proceedings, which are still going on. But as a general rule, I would follow the Federal Trade Commission cybersecurity best practice guidelines. And would you like me to give a few examples?
Sure.
Okay. The security by design, this is huge. All the agencies are talking about them. Just security should be designed into every IoT product at every stage of development, including early on.
Yes.
Another huge one is data minimization, okay? So IoT companies should examine their data practices and develop policies and practices that impose reasonable limits on the collection and retention of consumer data. And that is huge because one of the questions that was teed up at CES with the FTC chairwoman was that how much data is needed for an application. How much data is needed to run a system, and anything else could be superfluous. So that's really huge, data minimization. Another thing is privacy and security risk assessment. Equipment manufacturers should take a thorough consideration of all possible risks, including smart defaults, and they should require consumers to change the default passwords during the setup process. As you may know, these default passwords are targeted by malware, right?
Sure.
And that's going to be, that's going to be one thing that the manufacturer should do. Bright red letters on the boxes of any device. Change the password. Don't use the default password.
Yeah.
And then access control measures, limiting the ability of unauthorized persons to access a consumer device. That's authentication, encryption, things like that. So these are, and there's a lot more, but we'd be here all day if we talked about all the guidelines. But the FTC does have available on their website best practices for IoT service providers.
So a good place to start, and we'll include this link in the show analysis notes for everyone who's wants to get at it. But a good place to start is start with what's there now, and we'll start with the FTC because they seem to be pretty far along. And then you got to keep on top of it as things develop. And I suppose, you were talking about the, just the process. Maybe you can talk to me a little bit about the process. Are we talking requests for comments right now? Are we talking, yours still? And I know it covers a lot of different areas, but when are we still 2 years away before the dust kind of settles? And I'm not going to say it's ever going to settle, but before the dust settles to some degree of confidence, are we still 5 years away? What do you think?
Well, there's a couple of interesting points right now. I mean, we obviously just had a change in administration, right? So a lot of the rules that are currently percolating at the various agencies are now under review, let's say.
Right. Yeah.
But one good thing about this is that what may help to speed it up, Bruce, is that a lot of these rulemaking proceedings at the FCC and Commerce, they were signed off by both sides of the aisle, before they started the notice of proposed rulemaking. So I would say, well, first of all, just quickly, the deadlines for the Department of Commerce proceeding, the cybersecurity proceeding, the deadline is February 27th if you want to submit in that, okay?
And then how long does it take from there? I mean, just to give like a rough idea.
Well, Commerce, though, has been very quick. They actually had, this is the second phase of their rulemaking proceeding. They submitted a request for comments about a year ago. They got the comments, reviewed them very quickly, and in October they came out with a green paper that they were going to be sharing with other government agencies to try to coordinate cybersecurity issues. And so what they're doing now is there's still some unanswered questions to the proposals that came up in the green paper. So they're submitting a second round of comments. But one thing that's definite is that this is a red light issue for the federal government. And I would say that probably, if I had to guess, I'd say 2.5 years, but maybe even sooner, have some coordination among the various government agencies to come up with some rules. And there could be some new legislation too, because the FTC, they don't make rules; they just enforce the legislation. They want some more teeth in the existing FTC Act, because the FTC Act basically prevents deceptive advertising, right? And not having cybersecurity is considered to be a deceptive form.
Interesting.
Right. And they can. That's a wide open area. So the FTC has gone after, as Alex mentioned, Vizio, but they still need some more teeth in the legislation. So I would look at Congress probably to come out with some new legislation. But I would say that considering that this is on the front burner, it's not going to be that long. This is not something that they're going to be sitting on longer.
And you're saying Congress, so then you're implying that we're going to have, is it going to be a combination of laws and regulations, mostly laws, or what is the mix there?
Well, it'll first obviously be laws from Congress, and if they amend the FTC Act to include more information about cybersecurity, then the FTC can just take that and run with it on their enforcement actions. If it's something that's under the bailiwick of the FCC will have to undergo a rulemaking proceeding, which could take up to a year, and then they would promulgate the rules. But FTC would definitely be the fastest, and I would say DOC, Department of Commerce, would be next because they're well into this. The FCC may be lagging a little bit, but I'll just quickly turn it over to Alex. I mean, the FCC deals with telecommunications regulations and a lot of IoT outside of equipment authorization. But we should get back to that in a minute. But a lot of it would would not fall under the bailiwick of the FCC. Correct, Alex?
Yeah, right. I mean, the FCC regulates telecommunications companies. One area that is important is recently in 2015 there was the change where the FCC decided to regulate broadband internet access providers,
right?
Service providers, ISPs. What happened there was kind of interesting. The FTC used to regulate them and had different cases that went after these ISPs if they didn't follow through with the privacy practices that they said that they were going to follow through with. But then when the FCC reclassified those as regulated, and the purpose of that was the net neutrality rules from 2015, what happened was the FTC couldn't regulate them anymore. The FTC has a common carrier exception. That's a lot of legalese, but the point is the FTC lost its authority over ISPs, and the FCC gained it. So the FCC recently in October put together new privacy rules, and those are coming into effect at the end of this year, but also throughout this year. And so, to the extent that a company has an internet service provider, component, those would be important to pay attention to.
Right. No, definitely. Well, guys, at this point, I think it'd be useful. I mean, we're kind of getting into an alphabet soup here, and I'm Canadian, so I'm just, I kind of know a lot of these acronyms, but there's a lot of international listeners. So if you guys can give us just a little bit of a round robin of the different agencies, their acronyms, what the acronyms mean, what they do, kind of what their IoT focus is. And then I'm going to talk about, and then I want you to talk about also kind of the international implications, because even though these are government agencies, they're going to have an impact on all companies if they, well, I want you guys to talk about it, but there will be an impact on all of them. So Ron, why don't you take us through kind of the alphabet soup of the different agencies, what they do, what the acronyms stand for, just at a high level, so we have a map that we can kind of work from.
Right. Okay, well, first of all, we have the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, right? And as Alex mentioned, they regulate telecommunications providers and variances of that. But one thing that is very important for the international listeners, and actually anybody in IoT to know, is that the FCC also regulates any type of equipment that emits RF frequencies, emissions. And basically, I could just go through this pretty quickly. The FCC's equipment authorization process is very convoluted, and it definitely affects international manufacturers. Just quick 30,000-foot view of what happens is if a device has a transmitter in it, it is considered to be an intentional radiator, and that's what they call it, and it has to go through the FCC certification process, which means that a device is submitted to a lab for testing. Then the test results and prototypes are submitted to the telecommunications labs that are run by the FCC. They call them telecommunications certification bodies. Assuming all goes well, it's posted on the FCC's website as approved, and then all the manufacturers have to label the devices.
Right. And there's that little logo.
Right, exactly. And also, depending on the device too, sometimes it has to say this is subject to Part 15, and it is it meets the requirements of the FCC's rules. And then for devices that don't have transmitters in them, they're called unintentional radiators, and they are subject to self-certification, which means that the manufacturer or the vendor has to submit it to a testing lab anyway. But you keep the results of that, and then you have verification or declaration of conformity from the testing lab, which you hold on to, and then you slap a label on the device, and you can sell it then. But you do have to have the verification or declaration of conformity. Those are the two different types of self-certification. Now, where it gets complicated for international manufacturers, say you manufactured a device in China, it used to be that you could use almost any lab and then get it certified, and import it to the U.S. and you can still market it. But now you have to get it certified by an FCC-approved international lab. And there are databases you can find these, but if you don't do that and you don't get it properly labeled, you won't be able to import your devices. They'll stop it. Customs will stop it. Customs has a very specific way of dealing with this. Also, one thing I should also mention too is that devices that are intended for commercial use versus devices that are intended for consumer use are subject to two different types of testing, and the consumer devices are more stringent. So you can't just say this is my device and test it, for industrial use and sell it for consumers, because that's a no-no.
No, that's a good differentiation then. Okay.
Yeah.
And so like a sensor network, obviously this is going to be an intentional RF. So definitely if you're doing any wireless sensing, then you're going to be having to look at the FCC.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless it's a receive sensor, I guess. I mean, some devices like, say, RFID, right? I mean, if it's a receive tag, then it's an unintentional radiator, and you do the self-certification. But suffice it to say that the FCC had a series of rules that came out last year for importation. So they are taking a look at this, and it's very important to know this. But one thing that they should know too, though, for the manufacturers out there, is you can import a limited number of your devices for testing in the U.S., but you have to, without getting it certified, but you do have to go through a rigmarole with the customs regs to get them to do that. And there are a number of devices, a limited number of devices you can import for testing purposes without having to get them certified.
So that brings up a good question then, Ron. So we're developing, let's say, and I can talk, one of my clients, they're developing a manufacturing wireless network. And before, what you're saying is, I guess I want to know where is it that you need to start doing the regulations? So the prototype, probably not. The proof of concept, probably not. You stop me where I'm wrong. The minimally viable product, not until it's been released. Is it just on release date? Is it when you start? Is it when? What's the trigger that says, okay, now it needs to be regulated? How far can you go along in the development process before you need to deal with these regulations and laws?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Bruce, and it depends on the individual device. Certain devices that have powerful transmitters in them, you need an experimental license before you can even test. Yeah.
Okay.
But for low power devices, generally there's exceptions in the rules for, and I think we're mostly talking about low power devices.
Yeah.
Right. Low power devices, you can usually test without too much of a problem, but you want to make sure that before you even advertise anything, that it is certified and properly labeled. I mean,
interesting. Okay, so that's interesting. You're saying even just publicly notifying about the device, you're saying that's when it needs to be certified?
Right. If you're advertising it, and also that there's at trade shows too, and this is honored more in the breach than in the observance. But if you are displaying a non-certified RF device at a trade show.
But not for sale, let's say, right?
Right. That's permitted, but you do have to have a sign up next to the device saying that this has not yet been approved by the FCC and this is for testing purposes only. Now, having recently been to CES, I can tell you that
right.
Probably not everybody did that, but that's, that is in the rules, okay? And if you want to be in full compliance, you really need to know about things like the testing and the trade show exemptions, just to make sure that you're not caught, by an FCC troll who happens to be at a trade show, right?
Okay. So the FCC, is there anything else before we move on?
Well, as far as equipment authorization, I just want to mention one thing. When the FCC's current rulemaking proceeding is completed, they are going to likely implement cybersecurity rules in the equipment authorization rules, okay? Right now, there's no cybersecurity rules for equipment authorization. It's all based on RF emissions and interference. But when this rulemaking proceeding is done, it's very likely that there's going to be security by design requirements for equipment manufacturers in the IoT realm, or anybody who manufactures a device that these will be in there. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but that's basically where.
But that's big. That's big.
Big. It is big. And
that's a big change, right? I mean, in responsibility.
And one other thing I should mention, just because this one is, people get caught on this a lot, is if you have a device and you resell it, okay, if you modify that device and you modify it in any meaningful way, meaning basically anything other than slapping a different cover on it, you're going to be the responsible party for FCC enforcement proceedings. So I just want to throw that out too. Is if you're a reseller of RF equipment, you better be sure that you don't have people in there modifying the device, because you're the one who's going to be on the hook if it causes interference.
That's kind of an issue. And what about if you're a system integrator? I'm writing software to interface with it. Am I modifying it? I guess the question is, what's the definition of modification? But what if you're a system integrator? Because that's going to affect a lot of people listening.
Yes, and the FCC has new rules coming out this year about just that question. Software modification. The big issue is going to be the manufacturer is going to be required to have enough firewalls there so that people can't alter the software, basically, okay? And software-defined radio manufacturers are really worried about this, okay? So it's going to be that, this is a cybersecurity issue, obviously.
Sure.
If you have a software-defined radio and you don't have enough protection in the design, then you're going to be held responsible if it does get modified. So there you go. And that's sort of an exception to the general rule. But yes, I mean, software-defined, open source software is another issue that's coming up. But yes, I mean, you really do have to protect for unauthorized modification of the software.
So, and what about the glue software? So if I'm writing glue software to attach this component to this component, am I safe as long as I don't modify the software of the components themselves?
Yeah, actually, I think in a general rule, that's right. With the IoT now, the FCC's new rules that they're going to be coming out with, and these will be delayed a little bit because of the new administration, but there's going to be rules about components, and there's going to be rules about whether you can get a device certified individually or all the components together. And these are things that are still up in the air because right now the general rule is, the component, the manufacturer, the component are responsible. But as a practical matter, though, if somebody puts together a product and it has components that are manufactured by different entities, if the device as a whole passes, you don't really have to worry too much. But there are rules coming out now, new rules about component authorization, and these will be coming out probably in the summer, maybe the fall.
Okay, let's move on to FTC. What is it? What do they do? And why does it matter?
Okay. Well, FTC, as we mentioned, is not a rulemaking agency. Basically, they just have to enforce the FTC Act. And again, as we mentioned earlier, they consider anything, if you don't take care of the data security, they consider that deceptive marketing, and they will go after you for that. So the Federal Trade Commission, though, and I think Alex alluded to this earlier, there's something of a turf battle between the Federal Trade Commission and the FCC about.
Yeah, it sounds like there's some overlap there with respect to the data security, right?
Right, there is, and but the deal is, I think that probably when all is said and done, a lot of the IoT enforcement will come under FTC jurisdiction. But once the new cybersecurity rules are put in place for the FCC equipment authorization, I think the FCC will be the initial enforcement entity. But, as I mentioned earlier, the Department of Commerce, we'll get that in a minute, they put together a green paper. There's going to be a lot more sharing of information among the various agencies than there used to be, because they have to coordinate on these cybersecurity issues. I mean, they might not want to, but they're going to have to. Turf battles will be there, but just to get back to your initial question, Federal Trade Commission, basically deceptive advertising and marketing, lack of data security is a deceptive marketing.
Interesting. Yeah.
I know. I mean, it's a violation. If you don't have reasonable security for consumer data, that's considered a deceptive act.
Did not know that. Okay. All right. And so the big difference is just being deceptive versus transmitting electromagnetic waves. What are some other things we need to think about for the FTC?
That's basically it. I mean, and the FTC the FCC, again, they have the guidelines that are available right now. And obviously, because the FTC put out the guidelines, they're basically saying follow these guidelines or you may be open to being prosecuted for deceptive practices. So I think that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
And they're the first to get them out. So as we were saying earlier, follow FTC for now,
right.
and then keep a close eye. Okay, from the FTC, where are we going?
Oh, okay. Just one thing I should mention really quickly, Bruce, about the FTC is that you may have heard of this device called a breathometer, and it's like a home breathalyzer where this company marketed it as an FDA registered device, and that was not the case. The FDA didn't sign off on it, and there was also issues with degradation of performance and whatnot too. So the FTC has an enforcement issue. They just recently had a settlement with this company, but there was an enforcement proceeding against this company. So this is an example of overlap between the Food and Drug Administration,
right,
which does have some regulations for equipment as well, and the Federal Trade Commission. But I think for our purposes, the next agency we should talk about is the Department of Commerce.
Mm-hmm.
And the Department of Commerce,
the DOC, yeah.
DOC, right. This one also has, this agency also has jurisdiction over interstate commerce, right? So they have jurisdiction to put out their own set of guidelines for cybersecurity, and I'm sure they're going to be working closely with the FTC and the FCC to hammer something out. But they've got this, this rulemaking proceeding going on right now for cybersecurity issues, and that's something that people would be well advised to take a look at. But they regulate interstate commerce, so if there are cybersecurity issues involving a device that's brought over state lines, comes into their jurisdiction.
But doesn't that completely overlap FTC and FCC? Are we now we're talking about three overlapping areas here?
Right.
Or are there differences that you can tease apart?
Alex.
Well, so the Department of Commerce has an agency called NTIA, and that agency is the administration's connection to telecommunications,
right.
Versus the Federal Communications Commission, which is an independent agency. And so
okay.
there is definitely dialogue between the agencies. And under the Obama administration, NTIA focused a lot on many of these IoT issues, but none of it was put into rulemaking because that would be what the FCC works on. Instead, it was put into different white papers and green papers and ideas for the industry to self-regulate and things to that extent.
Right, and they recently changed that though with this rulemaking proceeding that is going on. But again, as to Alex's point, this green paper that DOC put together, and they're now seeking comment on that is going to be shared among the various federal agencies. So yes, overlap, and they are trying to sort out the turf battles right now.
And I think most of us can kind of figure out what you mean by it. But what is a green paper?
Oh, a green paper is the Department of Commerce's version of the summation of comments that they solicited in their request for comment. So last year about this time, they came out with a request for comment, public comment. They got hundreds of comments in, they reviewed them, and they summarized their findings, and there are now proposals in the green paper, which is available on the Department of Commerce website and the NTIA portion of the Department of Commerce website. There are still open issues specifically on privacy and cybersecurity, and they are seeking comment on their initial findings, and they'll put together a final paper, and they're going to be sharing that with the other agencies. So the green paper is just summation of comments and initial proposals.
Okay, and so we'll include the specific link that you're talking about here for the DOC. And green paper, is this specific to the DOC, or is it just a generalized term that you're applying to the DOC in this particular case?
Oh, it is. It's specific to the DOC, but
it is. Okay. Okay.
Overlapping issues.
Yeah. No, it sounds like if we're looking at this Venn diagram, we got 3 so far. What else do we have, guys? Are we still on the DOC, or are we moving on to somewhere else?
Okay. So one other agency that is important to be aware of is, of course, NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration.
Mm-hmm.
That they are the primary regulators of cars, right? And as we know, there's an increase in self-driving cars. We saw many rolling out at CES earlier this year.
Yes.
And it was, it's been interesting to see, where those are going with that new technology. Now, NHTSA has not traditionally been very good at regulating technology versus regulating the safety of cars.
Right.
So that may be an area where they're going to have to improve. So for sort of services inside the car, right? For instance, a telecommunications service. Mm-hmm. All cars right now are connected. To the wireless network. So for those kinds of services, that would still be the FCC or some rulemaking, but from some other NTIA kind of proceeding. But NHTSA is trying to push more into that area as it relates to safety.
Okay, so yeah, and a driverless car is an IoT product, and so it is very pertinent here. Now, you mentioned earlier the FDA, obviously medical devices, IoT medical devices. Are they, it's interesting because I was teaching a workshop, it was about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and one of the attendees there, he worked for a medical device company. And the question that he brought up when we were having lunch kind of in between our workshop was, where does the medical device stop? Because if it's connected to the cloud and, then connected to these other services, it used to be just a device that's in the operating room, let's say. What are your guys' thoughts on that? Has that been addressed yet, or is it still is that still a work in progress?
Well, I think two things. First off, for whenever you have a question about, where the agency's authority is, we look to the regulation, right? And we look to the actual definitions of what is regulated as a medical device. Now, that probably needs to be clearer. But the other thing I would mention is, I remember when the Apple Watch came out, this was, sort of a big discussion.
Interesting. Yeah, okay.
Apple was definitely meeting with FDA quite a bit to make sure that they didn't step over that line. So that is an area where, companies who are rolling out new products really do have to consider, going in and meeting with these agencies to look at what the product is and where. And, Apple didn't roll out everything that they might have wanted to, in their Apple Watch because of the danger that, maybe something, that's telling you about your health could actually go too far. And that goes back to the breathalyzer that Ron talked about. If you're, going to be saying that this has scientific accuracy and can really, answer some of these medical questions that are important because, you want to know if you can drive, right? You have to be able to answer that question. It can't be, cool. It's actually, a medical device. So those kinds of questions, where that line is, companies really do have to pay attention to and look toward the FDA's, definitions, but also just be careful, right? You don't want to put out something, promise something that you can't actually keep. And that's where the FTC comes in later.
Now, are you guys aware of the definition of a medical product? Has it extended beyond just a discrete product that's within the hand of the doctor, nurse, surgeon, or is this still something that needs to be, I guess, further looked into, or has that definition changed?
It has not changed. I don't have the definition in front of me, but again, a company would want to be careful about where that definition is. And with
So make sure you're complying with it as it is today, but just realizing that an IoT product, right, extends beyond just the local area. So it sounds like if you're developing a medical device, you may have to worry about compliance with the FDA, the DOC, the FTC, the FCC. It's pretty complicated. So, I mean, what's your advice here for someone, and I know this is a very specific part of the audience, but if they are doing something in the medical realm, what's your advice right now?
I think one thing you have to be aware of is these laws were not built for, the products that are coming out today.
Yeah.
And so you do have to really delve in deep and figure out where, each, product meets with the law. An example is HIPAA, right? That's a health privacy law. A lot of people don't realize, but that doesn't just cover anything that's health related. It has to do with who's holding the data. A doctor may be covered, but, if a company collects health data, they might not be covered. A company that then uses that data to market or a service or a product or do something that a consumer doesn't expect may, get into some trouble, not just with an agency, but with the goodwill of their customers. So companies have to understand that, there isn't today baseline privacy laws. There isn't one law that covers everything. There are sector-specific laws. They're all, related to different agencies, and to understand, where those laws are going and how to comply with the discrete areas of each one.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's a task, for a company.
It's a task, and what I was going to say, it sounds expensive. That's what I was going to say.
It can be.
It can be, although it doesn't have to be. I mean, if companies, really pay attention to, what their risk is, where their exposure is, and work to address issues and that kind of thing.
And I should mention just in that vein, Bruce, is that we specialize here with best practices guides, and we draft them up either client specific or general guides for regulations. And Alex put together a really nice privacy guide, which deals with a lot of FTC and FCC issues that can be related to IoT. And I drafted last year a global equipment authorization guide, which could be very interesting to some of your international clients, because it talks about the regulations that many countries around the world require to market in their own countries, and also what you need to do to import into the various countries. So that's something that your audience might be interested in. But as far as our clients are concerned, you mentioned broadly, if you give us a device or a service, we can put together a best practices guide which spells out all the regulatory requirements and recommendations to be in compliance with them, even risk assessments, how much do you want to risk? I mean, design it this way, things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. We've been talking about privacy, but that is, again, just one form of risk. And I think if we get into the others, that'll probably be another show. But I think for people listening now, a good piece of advice, I believe, would be to talk to your general attorney. But most likely, you're going to need to be directed to a specialized firm. And so, guys, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your company as an example of a specialized law firm dealing, right in the heart of things with IoT?
Okay. Well, we specialize in IoT, absolutely, and we have attorneys that can assist clients with virtually any aspect of IoT. We have a really good patent attorney now too, who's had a lot of experience in high tech issues, and he's great for the patent issues. Now that could be another show right there.
Yeah, it is another show right there. Yeah, specifically with all the method patents that come out of IoT. But okay.
Yes, that's correct, and we try to watch out for those patent trolls too, because that's that can stifle innovation. And I don't have too high opinion of people like that. No. But yeah, we can help with compliance. We also have a sister group called the Compliance Group, which does flat fee alternative fee arrangements all the time for companies that just want to be in compliance with various federal and state rules. And that includes taxes. We have a newly automated tax system which covers virtually any kind of tax that needs to be filed. So we have tax, we have FCC, we have FTC, DOC, patents, and we also have a lot of good transactional people that can assist with any sort of mergers and acquisitions. And there's a lot of FCC requirements for that. And we have some international people that can help with that too, and customs and whatnot too. So everything that our whole entire firm is telecommunications based, and IoT being sort of a subsection of IoT, telecommunications we certainly deal with that. And one other thing too is equipment authorization. That's one of my babies. I do a lot of work with equipment manufacturers, and also at the FCC representing them in case they get in trouble with the Enforcement Bureau.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to think about. And where can people find you on the interwebs? Okay. Well, our website is www.comlawgroup.com. That's comlaw with 2 M's. Mm-hmm. And I'll put this on the show analysis notes. But okay. And they can find out pretty much everything about our IoT practice there. All right, guys. Well, that was very helpful. I appreciate the map of the different agencies, and I think I'm not alone in that. It's really been enlightening for me, and thank you. We'll talk to you guys soon. Oh, thank you, Bruce, for the opportunity to do this podcast. I hope your audience finds it interesting.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, that was episode 75. An excellent number, made out of 3 and 5s. To get analysis of this episode, the links, and the transcript, go to the show analysis notes. This one and all of them can be found at iotinc.com/podcast. Remember, there is that hyphen between the IoT and the Inc. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, there are 3 ways you can share the love. Well, soon to be 2 ways. You can share it on social by going to the show analysis notes and clicking on the social widget. It's going to be either on the left or the bottom of the page. You can leave a rating or a review on iTunes. We're getting up there in numbers. Just go to iotinc.com/iTunes. It only takes 1 click and maybe a little bit longer if you want to write your thoughts out. I read every one of them and I appreciate every one of them as well. And you can leave a donation via PayPal. Well, at least for now. This has been a complete fail, so I'm going to remove it from every page. So donate now while you still can. And a big shout out for Quirk Bullis. He made the first and only donation in mid-December for $20. Quirk, you're the man. And a big thank you to you. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your path to IoT business be a compliant one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.